I'm not the only one.
We're about to crack open the Spider-Verse. The animated hit Into the Spider-Verse is getting a sequel called Across the Spider-Verse Part 1, and if I was a betting man, I'd imagine we're about to be introduced to a whole gaggle of alternate Spider-Mans from across the vast multiverse. But today, I want to get a little weird. What are some of the strangest versions of Spider-Man that should appear in the sequel? How about an Old West Cowboy Spider-Man? A Cyborg Spider-Man? A Spider-Man that's actually just a huge mound of spiders in a Spider-Man suit? A Spider-Man that loves Twinkies? Yeah, there are some weird ones. Let's get into it right now. Alright, I need to get one of the grossest, weirdest versions of Spider-Man out of the way first. Honestly, we don't know how lucky we got it. Our Peter Parker is just a dude who was bit by a spider and developed spider powers. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, let me introduce you to Spiders-Man. In a different universe, Peter Parker was an intelligent young student who was touring a science facility called Horizon Labs. One of the experiments the lab was conducting was unleashing a ton of radioactive particles on a massive colony of spiders. You know, for science purposes. Now, this Peter Parker's luck is probably worse than his other universe counterparts because Peter ended up falling into the colony and was completely devoured by the spiders. Yikes. But at that moment, the colony became a single hive mind and basically absorbed Peter's consciousness. They think they are Peter Parker and put on a suit to fight crime. That's right, the mound of spiders dress up in a costume. So if you're a criminal and you come across Spiders-Man, imagine your absolute terror when suddenly a hole punctures in the suit and 1,000 spiders come spilling out of it. I think if I saw that, I'd either give up my life of crime right there on the spot, or my heart would explode from pure terror. What could be better than seeing a man with spider powers? How about a dinosaur with spider powers? Yeah, that's right, this next entry is perfect for all those fans who love superhero movies but just wish it would someday cross over with Jurassic Park. Earth 99476 is one where reptiles are dominant and everyone looks like an advanced, evolved version of a dinosaur. Everyone looks pretty good for having a dinosaur makeover, but of course the one I want to talk about most today is Arachnosaur, which, as you can imagine, is basically a velociraptor in a Spider-Man outfit. Apart from wondering just how Arachnosaur functions in everyday life, the most interesting tidbit is the fact that Arachnosaur is a member of the Fantastic Five, alongside, okay, forgive me for all the dinosaur puns, Arachnosaur fights alongside Dino Torch, Invisiguanodon, Soar Fantastic, and Thing. Yeah, it's unfortunate Thing didn't get a dinosaur nickname, but I guess it's hard to do something with that. If any of you can think of a great dinosaur name for the Thing in the comments, I'm all ears. Into the Spider-Verse really kept the focus on Spider-Man and different variations of the Web-Slinger, but I hope Across the Spider-Verse branches out and includes some versions that are mashups of other popular superheroes. The most interesting of that bunch would be Spider-Hulk. The name is kind of self-explanatory, right? In the comics, there's actually a few different versions of Spider-Hulk across the multiverse. One of them appeared in the Web of Spider-Man series back in 1990. Peter Parker faced the Hulk in battle and ended up being zapped by a Hulk energy blast. This really messed with Peter's senses for a few days until eventually he got angry, and let me tell you, I really liked it when he was angry. Peter transformed into Spider-Hulk and did what you'd expect from a Spider-Hulk. He started smashing things. I think a Spider-Hulk in Across the Spider-Verse would be awesome to see because it would add some serious muscle to the group. Spider-Man's already strong naturally, but there's something about the brute force of Hulk that's always fun to watch. Plus, it would be fascinating to see how Spider-Hulk operates. Spider-Man is agile and dexterous. Hulk is a blunt, rampaging monster. Those two sides clash, so which one would win out if we saw Spider-Hulk? Or would we see a perfect hybrid that's as powerful as Hulk, but as agile as Spider-Man? That would make Spider-Hulk almost unstoppable. So I always love the versions of Spider-Man that take place in alternate time periods. There are a few of them on this list, but I think one of the most prominent is the Spider from 1602. And yeah, that's the year, not the Earth designation. The Marvel 1602 era takes place during the Elizabethan era, and we see different versions of Spider-Man, Nick Fury, the Fantastic Four, Doctor Doom, and more. Legendary writer Neil Gaiman is the author behind it, so if you haven't checked it out yet, go do that. So let's talk about the Spider. His name is still Peter Parker, but it's spelled a bit different. It's spelled P-A-R-Q-U-A-G-H. And his backstory is relatively the same, but with some Elizabethan tweaks. Throughout the original Marvel 1602 series, the running gag was how this Peter kept almost getting bitten by unusual spiders, but managed to avoid it until the very last issue of the original Marvel 1602 series, and then had his powers develop fully in the sequel series. I think adding some Shakespearean flair to the Spider-Verse would be hilarious. Like, just imagine the conversation Spider-Man Noir would have with the spider from 1602. And I would hope if the spider shows up in Across the Spider-Verse, his fate isn't the same as his comic counterpart. Like a lot of these Spider-Men, the spider had his life force sucked out by Morlun. Bummer. Covenant of the Shield comic series is set in a sword and sorcery version of the Marvel Universe, so it's sort of like Dungeons and Dragons but with Marvel characters, and if that doesn't entice you, I don't know what does. The Spider-Man of this universe goes by the Web-Slinger. His history is kind of quirky. So when he was a child, he was fascinated with spiders and eventually traveled to Webwood and met the mysterious Widow of the Web. He then begged her to teach him everything there was to know about spiders, and the boy was gifted with all the powers of the Spider Kingdom. Yeah, as I said, he really loved spiders. But I guess in that era, what else was there to love? Netflix and YouTube weren't around yet, so you might as well become fascinated with insects. And the look of the Web-Slinger is both cool and a little frightening. He's not just some guy in a costume, but rather he has extra arms and can generate his own webs, and definitely looks more like a giant spider than we're probably used to. I like the element of how, even though he's a hero who protects people, the world around him sort of fears him because he looks like a monster, and some claim that he's no better than the bad guys he fights. So even though this is set in medieval times, it still captures the same essence of modern-day Spider-Man. The Spider-Man over in Earth 2818 seems pretty normal on first glance. He's in the classic suit, he's quippy, and he looks pretty unassuming. It's only when you sneak up on him and suddenly a massive sonic cannon appears on his back that you realize maybe there's more to this Spider-Man than meets the eye. Yes, this is Cyborg Spider-Man, and I immediately want to see a whole comic series devoted to this character. Come on, seeing Spidey swing around on webs is cool and all, but you're telling me you aren't more interested if his arm could suddenly become a laser rifle and he looks like he's about to hunt down John Connor? What's really interesting is that the suit looks to be a part of him and it transforms around his cyborg body. And I guess that's better than the alternative. Can you imagine a big robot trying to squeeze into spandex? I don't think so. So what gives with Cyborg Spidey? Did a horrible accident leave him broken and he was forced to upgrade to cybernetic parts? Did a regular version of Peter Parker build this version of Cyborg Spidey? So many questions, and it's something Across the Spider-Verse could explore more. I could see Cyborg Spider-Man and Penny Parker getting along, don't you? Yeah, not all Spider-Men across the multiverse are good guys. Into the Spider-Verse presented the idea that all the versions of Spider-Man were heroes in their dimension, so I think a fun addition to the sequel would be to introduce some evil webheads. And I would say Man-Spider is one of the worst and most terrifying. Over on Earth 51412, there's a character named Patton Parnell. That should be the first red flag right there that we aren't getting another universe version of the generally good-hearted Peter Parker. Anyways, Patton Parnell lived with his abusive Uncle Ted and had a major crush on his neighbor, Sarah Jane. Sarah asks Patton to help her expose illegal experimentation on animals at Alcorp, and while looking around, Patton is bitten by a huge red spider. And yes, he gains spider powers, but just not the comic-friendly ones like super strength and agility. No, he develops a thirst for webbing up and devouring small animals before working his way up to people. He transforms into a hideous spider monster and ends up biting Sarah Jane. Thankfully, Morlun shows up and drains his life force, which is one of the only good things Morlun has ever done. Though it's a little too late, as the bite that Sarah Jane got causes hundreds of spiders to be born within her and burst out. Yeah, it's disgusting. Having Man-Spider as a villain in Across the Spider-Verse would up the creep factor by a lot. Spider-Man already sort of feels like a cowboy, right? I mean, he has the swagger for it and is just missing the general Old West setting and a cowboy hat. Well, would you be surprised if I told you that the Spider-Man on Earth 31913 is just an Old West version of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man? Yep, this version is Patrick O'Hara, a gunslinger that was bitten by a spider that was bathed in a special elixir given to Patrick by an Apache shaman. And fun fact, the spider also bit his horse, which was aptly named Widow. So both of them developed superpowers. Patrick and Widow even developed what's called Rider Sense, which is a telepathic connection that helps them fight criminals like an Old West Morbius the living vampire. And the small detail that I want to highlight is that you'd obviously expect Cowboy Spider-Man, aka the Web-Slinger, to wear a mask. But Widow also wears a little Spidey mask. It's adorable. Across the Spider-Verse needs to amp up the crazy Spider-Man it introduces, and I think the Cowboy Webhead and his trusty steed would make for wonderful additions to the group. Okay, Zombie Spider-Man is technically a zombie that devours living flesh, but let me tell you, he does feel really bad about it. In the zombie universe, this Peter Parker was bitten by Colonel America, and while the zombie apocalypse was just beginning, he arrived at home to try to get MJ and Aunt May out of the city. But then the new zombified Peter got really hungry and just couldn't control himself. No more MJ and Aunt May. Whoops. This guilt eventually led Zombie Spider-Man to save the day by betraying his fellow zombies and stopping the zombie plague from spreading to the rest of the multiverse. Can you imagine if Zombie Spider-Man was in Across the Spider-Verse? I just imagine a very intelligent, very calm version of the character who's consistently trying to not eat Spider-Ham. Like maybe he has to carry around chickens or something so he doesn't get the urge to eat his new friends. It would be a nice piece of corporate synergy to include this Spidey since Disney Plus is gearing up for their own Marvel Zombies animated show. Regular zombies aren't as exciting anymore, but superhero zombies are all the rage. Okay, Golden Spongecake Spider-Man might be my favorite goofy version of the character. And the way they introduced him in the original comic storyline was hilarious. So Spider-Man was once used as basically a spokesman for Hostess products, appearing in Marvel Hostess ads, which were quick stories that saw Spider-Man defeat villains with the deliciousness of Hostess snacks. Simple, right? Well, they made this a legitimate Spidey universe in the original Spider-Verse comic, and there was a quick page of Moreland showing up to feast on this Spidey's life force. Golden Spongecake Spider-Man tried his usual method of attack, which was throwing snacks at Moreland, but obviously this didn't go well. Moreland sucked out his life force and commented on what a sweet and succulent soul this Spider-Man had. There even was a cheeky reference to Hostess ads with the page ending with the line, "You get a big delight in every bite of spider totems." Just absolutely hilarious. Can you imagine if Across the Spider-Verse included a version of Spider-Man that smelled delicious and liked to throw Twinkies at bad guys? How long do you think he would last in other universes? 10 seconds? 5 seconds? Man, now I'm hungry. Okay, this one isn't really a weird Spider-Man variation, but I think it's important enough to include. Spider-Girl is Mayday Parker, the teenage daughter of Peter and MJ. Her history is interesting as she first appeared in a What If comic, but then eventually became popular enough to get her own comic series. She faced villains like Black Tarantula, Dragon King, and even Hobgoblin. Just think for a second on what her addition could do for Across the Spider-Verse. If you remember, Peter B. Parker's whole arc in the first Into the Spider-Verse film was how he didn't necessarily want kids with his MJ, and through his interactions with Miles, he came around to the idea and ended the movie on a hopeful note. What if Across the Spider-Verse continues that thread and shows that this Peter's universe is farther in the future, where he has this teenage daughter that he's trying to train? That would be a fun new dynamic for the character, as well as highlight a fun new relationship between Mayday and Miles. Could make for an interesting love triangle between these two and Spider-Gwen. A memorable mini-arc in the Spidey comics was the time that Peter developed extra limbs and became Six-Armed Spider-Man. While visually it made hiding his secret identity a little challenging, it did help with his crime fighting as he was able to deal out more punches and move around a bit better. Of course, they couldn't keep Peter like this forever, and he went back to his puny two-armed normalcy. But in a special What If comic, there was the idea of what if Peter kept his 6 arms. In that comic, Morbius the living vampire, who had the cure, was actually eaten by sharks, and Peter's condition became permanent. Did it get him down? Actually, no. The extra arms allowed him to become an even better superhero and defeat his villains with ease, and then he eventually went on to become a spokesperson for the physically challenged. And while this character is great, I just love the visual of a 6-armed Spidey fighting crime and standing next to the other Spider-Man in Across the Spider-Verse. If there's one thing that's consistent about all Peter Parkers is that most of them have terrible luck. It's what makes them Spider-Man. So what happens if there's a Spider-Man that's practically perfect? That's the basis for Earth 11638's Peter Parker, who's rich, powerful, the world loves him, and he's never lost any of his loved ones. This version of Peter is so interesting to me. If you take away all the loss and heartbreak and bad luck, what type of man is Peter Parker? While most of the Spider-Man in Into the Spider-Verse were the same at their core, I want to see another Spidey thrown in there that believes in a totally different thing. And yeah, having a Spider-Man that's beloved by everyone and not having suffered a lot of loss, that that really is one of the weirder versions of the character. The Savage Land is a fun piece of geography that I hope some version of Spider-Man gets to explore at some point. It's a prehistoric jungle land hidden in Antarctica, and in Earth 83043 there's the Savage Spider-Man. His backstory is when Peter and his family were flying in a plane, it started to crash, and his parents gave him the only parachute. Peter landed in the Savage Land and was naturally raised by a bunch of giant spiders. After going through the trial of 1,000 venoms, where he's injected with all these different spider venoms, he got spider powers because of it. That seems much harder than just being bit by one radioactive spider, don't you think? Anyways, here's my dream. Savage Spider-Man is introduced in Across the Spider-Verse, and he's so well received that he gets his own spin-off movie. Kind of like the Lego Batman movie. I think we'd all be behind that, right? In the alternate comic story Spider-Man, Spider's Shadow, it details what would happen if Peter kept the symbiote suit. I think this is a fascinating idea because it highlights just how corrupt the suit would have made Spider-Man in the long run. Like, naturally he gets more and more aggressive and eventually turns into the menace that J. Jonah Jameson always feared by brutally executing his villains. Now, Across the Spider-Verse doesn't necessarily need to have a bad guy symbiote Spider-Man, but it would be interesting to see a version of that character that's more aggressive and angry than his fellow Spider people. Plus, Black Suit Spider-Man rules. So this was all about Across the Spider-Verse, but do you think any of these Spider-Man could successfully make the jump to live action? I don't know, I'd probably pass out if I saw Spider-Man fighting alongside Tom Holland, wouldn't you?